December 8, 1943, the ancient stones of San Pietro in Fine had witnessed 20 centuries of human history, wars, plagues, and the quiet rhythm of rural Italian life. But nothing could have prepared them for the storm that was about to break upon this small mountain village perched on the approaches to Monte Cassino. The winter air carried the distant rumble of artillery, a sound that had grown steadily closer over the past weeks, as the American 36th Texas Division pushed north against the formidable German winter line. For the 800 villagers who remained, caught in this terrible vice of history, time was running out. The village, with its narrow medieval streets and stone houses built into the very mountain itself, was about to become the epicenter of one of the most brutal battles of the Italian campaign, a name that would soon represent the true meaning of civilian suffering in modern warfare. Maria Olivieri woke before dawn, as she had done every day of her 52 years. The December cold bit through the thin walls of her ancient family home, the same house where generations of Olivieris had been born and died since the time of the Bourbons. The difference was that this morning, like every morning for the past month, she woke to the distant thunder of American artillery pounding the German positions on the ridgelines above the village. Her weathered hands, twisted from decades of working the olive groves that had sustained her family for generations, clutched the rough woolen blanket as she listened. The Germans had been in San Pietro since September, turning their village into a fortress, a critical defensive position guarding the road to Rome. Colonel Wisser's 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment had made it abundantly clear that they would defend this ground to the last man, and that no one was to leave. The penalty for attempting to flee was death, so the villagers remained, trapped between their ancient loyalty to hearth and home and the growing certainty that hell was coming to San Pietro. In the faint grey light seeping through her window, Maria could make out the silhouettes of German soldiers moving through her garden. They had been digging fighting positions all night, cutting down her century-old olive trees to create fields of fire and using the trunks to reinforce their bunkers. Each axe blow had felt like a physical pain to Maria. Those trees had been planted by her grandfather, had provided the oil that was the lifeblood of her family. Now they were just more material for the war machine that had enveloped their peaceful mountain village. She rose slowly, her joints aching with the damp cold that seeped up from the stone floor. There was no coffee anymore, no sugar, barely any food at all since the Germans had requisitioned most of their stores. She made do with a crust of stale bread dipped in the last of her olive oil. A bitter irony, considering the groves that had been destroyed. Down the narrow cobblestone street, Antonio Russo was helping his elderly father down to their cellar. At 78, Pietro Russo had survived the Great War, had seen fascism rise, and had watched in silence as his sons were drafted into Mussolini's armies. Now his youngest boy, just 17, was helping him navigate the worn stone steps in the pre-dawn darkness. The cellar, with its meter-thick stone walls built into the living rock of the mountain, was the safest place they could find. "Papa, you stay here today," Antonio whispered, his young face already old with worry. "The Americans are getting closer. The sergeant says they might attack today." Pietro nodded silently. He had heard the sound of the approaching front for weeks, had felt the earth tremble with impact of shells. He had also seen the German preparations, the machine gun nests being established in the ruins of the church, the mortar positions in what had once been the town square where he had played as a child. He knew what was coming. As the weak winter sun crested the mountains to the east, Captain Henry Wasco of the 36th Division stared through his binoculars at the village clinging to the mountainside. San Pietro was a formidable natural fortress, its stone buildings seeming to grow out of the very rock, its narrow streets perfect for defense. His men had been fighting their way north for months, from the beaches of Salerno, through rivers and mountains, in mud and cold that seemed to penetrate their very souls. Now this village stood between them and the road to Rome, a road that had already cost thousands of American lives. What made it worse was that Wascow knew civilians were still in there, hundreds of them, trapped by the German defenders who were using the village as a strongpoint. "God help them," he muttered, as he watched the first rays of sunlight illuminate the bell tower of the village church, where he could make out the distinctive shape of an MG-42 machine gun position. Behind him, his radioman was receiving the final orders for the attack that would begin in less than an hour. The morning progressed with an agonizing slowness for the villagers of San Pietro. By 10 o'clock, the American artillery had begun its preparatory bombardment in earnest. The ground shook continuously as 105 mm and 155 mm shells rained down on the German positions. For the civilians huddled in cellars and improvised shelters, it was as if the very mountain was coming apart around them. In the Olivieri cellar, Maria huddled with her daughter Sophia and 3 grandchildren, the youngest just 3 years old. They had been joined by the Bianchi family from next door after their home had taken a direct hit the previous day. 17 people crowded into a space barely 10 feet square, pressed against the cold stone walls as dust and small fragments of masonry showered down with each impact. The children whimpered quietly, too terrified even to cry properly anymore. They had been living this nightmare for days. Above them, the village was being systematically destroyed. The medieval church, with its priceless frescoes dating back to the 12th century, was hit repeatedly by American shells targeting the German observation post in its tower. The ancient bell, which had called the faithful to prayer since before Columbus sailed for the New World, gave one final discordant toll as the tower collapsed in a cloud of dust and pulverized stone. Houses that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Their contents, the accumulated treasures and mundane possessions of generations, scattered and burning. The olive oil jars in Maria's storeroom shattered as a shell impacted nearby, the precious golden liquid soaking into the earth lost forever. By noon, the American infantry began their advance. Captain Waskow led his company up the slope, moving from rock to shattered olive tree, every step bringing them closer to the village. The German response was immediate and devastating. Machine gun fire swept the open ground, mortar rounds exploded among the advancing Americans, and snipers picked off anyone who remained exposed for more than a few seconds. From their cellar, the Olivieris and Bianchis could hear the firefight drawing closer, the sharp crack of rifle fire, mixing with the hammering of machine guns and the distinctive sound of German and American submachine guns. The German burp guns, with their high cyclic rate, contrasting with the slower, heavier sound of the American Thompson. For Antonio Russo, the situation above ground had become untenable. A shell had collapsed part of their home, and water from a broken pipe was beginning to flood their cellar. His father, already weakened by age and hunger, was developing a racking cough in the damp cold. They would have to move to another shelter. Waiting for what seemed like a lull in the fighting, Antonio peered out from the remains of their doorway. The street he had played in as a child was now unrecognizable, filled with rubble and the splintered remains of furniture. A German half-track was burning at the intersection, its ammunition cooking off periodically with sharp cracks that echoed between the stone walls. Bodies in field grey were sprawled where they had fallen, and yet the machine gun in the church ruins continued to fire, sweeping the approaches to the village where the Americans were trying to advance. Taking a deep breath, Antonio ducked back inside to help his father. "We must go now, Papa," he said urgently. "We will try to reach the Olivieri cellar. It is deeper, safer." The old man nodded weakly, allowing himself to be helped to his feet. Together, they made their way out into the apocalyptic landscape that had once been their home. They had gone perhaps 20 meters when the air was split by the scream of incoming shells. The Americans had adjusted their artillery to target the machine gun position. Antonio threw himself over his father as the world exploded around them. When he regained consciousness minutes or hours later, he couldn't tell. He was partially buried in rubble, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that blocked out all other sound. His father lay motionless beside him, blood pooling from his ears and nose, eyes staring sightlessly at the smoke-filled sky. Inside the Olivieri cellar, time had lost all meaning. The bombardment had been continuous for hours, the concussion so violent that small objects jumped and danced across the floor with each impact. The air was thick with dust, and the acrid smell of explosives that seeped in from outside. Sophia's youngest child had developed a 1,000-yard stare, no longer reacting to the explosions, just rocking silently back and forth. The adults spoke little, conserving their energy, each lost in private prayers or memories of a time before this madness had engulfed their peaceful mountain community. Old Giuseppe Bianchi, who had fought at Caporetto in the Great War, shook his head slowly. "This is not war as I knew it," he whispered. "This is the end of the world." As afternoon faded toward evening, a new sound reached them. Voices speaking English, the distinctive southern drawls of the Texas Division. The American infantry had fought their way into the lower part of the village and were now clearing it house by house, cellar by cellar. The fighting was at its most intense and dangerous phase, with Germans and Americans often occupying different floors of the same shattered building, tossing grenades up or down stairwells, firing through holes in floors and ceilings. For the civilians caught in between, the danger was at its peak. Maria placed her finger to her lips, signaling everyone to remain absolutely silent. They could hear boots on the floor above them, The cough of a nervous soldier, the metallic sound of a weapon being readied. The cellar door was suddenly flung open, flooding the dark space with the fading grey light of the winter afternoon. Silhouetted in the doorway was a massive figure, helmet and combat gear, creating an inhuman outline. "Aliati!" Maria called out desperately. "Civilians, Bambini!" There was a moment of terrible tension as the figure raised his weapon, then lowered it. "Lieutenant," the soldier called over his shoulder, "we got civilians down here." Captain Waskow appeared in the doorway, his young face streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death. "How many?" he asked. When told there were 17, including children, he cursed softly. "Tell them we'll get them out when we can, but they need to stay put for now. This ain't over." He was right. Even as he spoke, the distinctive rattling sound of an MG-42 cut through the air from somewhere higher in the village, followed by the crack of American rifles returning fire. Night fell over San Pietro, but brought no respite from the fighting. The battle continued in the darkness, illuminated by the harsh white light of parachute flares and the orange glow of burning buildings. The temperature dropped sharply. The winter cold intensified by the lack of shelter, as more and more of the village was reduced to rubble. The civilians in the Olivieri cellar huddled together for warmth, sharing the few blankets they had managed to bring with them. The American soldiers had left them some K-rations and water, before moving on to clear the rest of the village. The unfamiliar food, canned ham and eggs, powdered coffee, biscuits that seemed indestructible, was consumed gratefully by people who had been on the edge of starvation for weeks. Throughout the night, the sounds of fighting ebbed and flowed around them. The Germans were conducting a fighting withdrawal, making the Americans pay for every meter of ground. Twice, the cellar changed hands as German counterattacks pushed the Americans back, only to be retaken hours later. Each time the civilians pressed themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible, as tired, angry young men with guns swept through the small space, checking for enemies, sometimes arguing over whether the civilians should be evacuated or left in place. By dawn, the Americans seemed to have secured the lower half of the village, but the Germans still held the upper sections, including the ruins of the ancient castle that crowned the hilltop. The second day of the battle for San Pietro brought no relief. If anything, the fighting intensified as fresh American troops were fed into the battle and the Germans received reinforcements of their own. The civilians in the Olivieri cellar could only wait and pray, their fate entirely in the hands of the young men fighting and dying in the ruins above them. Around mid-morning, the cellar door opened again, and a different American officer peered in. Unlike Captain Waskow's compassionate demeanor, this man's face showed only impatience and the pressure of combat. "We're moving all civilians out," he announced brusquely. "This area isn't secure. Follow my men, stay close to the walls, do exactly what they tell you." There was no time to gather possessions, no opportunity to ask questions. The 17 occupants of the cellar were herded into the street, blinking in the harsh winter sunlight that illuminated a landscape of utter devastation. What had once been the main street of San Pietro was now an unrecognizable landscape of rubble and craters. The familiar landmarks, the butcher shop with its painted sign, the communal fountain where women had gathered for centuries to do laundry and exchange gossip, the cafe where the men had played cards on Sunday afternoons, all were gone, replaced by a chaotic jumble of broken stone and splintered wood. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in German field grey, others in American olive drab, a few in the simple civilian clothes of villagers caught in the open. The survivors were guided through this apocalyptic terrain by grim-faced American soldiers, forced to step over or around the dead, holding the children's heads against their shoulders to shield them from the worst sights. They had gone perhaps 100 meters when the distinctive sound of an 80 mm German artillery piece split the air, followed by the scream of the incoming shell. "Down!" shouted the American sergeant, but it was too late. The shell impacted 20 meters ahead, sending a spray of stone fragments and shrapnel in all directions. When the dust cleared, 3 of the civilians lay dead or dying, including Sophia's husband, his body shielding their youngest child who somehow survived. The Americans rushed the survivors into the ruins of a stone house that still had part of its ground floor intact. "Stay here," ordered the sergeant. "We'll come back when it's safer." Hours passed. No one came. The sporadic crash of artillery continued, interspersed with bursts of machine gun fire and the occasional violent rattle of a house-to-house clearance operation. By nightfall, the group had been reduced to 14. An elderly woman had died quietly in the corner, her heart simply giving out after too much shock and privation. They had no food, no water, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Maria took charge, organizing the survivors to gather any usable materials from the ruins around them: pieces of wood for a small fire, scraps of cloth to serve as additional blankets. A lifetime of hardship had prepared her for this moment, and her calm efficiency kept panic at bay. "We have survived fascism, we have survived hunger," he told the group. "We will survive this too." The third day of the battle dawned with a strange, almost supernatural silence. After the continuous din of the previous 48 hours, the absence of gunfire and explosions was more unsettling than reassuring. Maria ventured to the remains of a window and peered out cautiously. The street was deserted, except for the ever-present dead. No sign of Germans or Americans. Had they moved on? Was the battle over? He was considering whether to risk going out in search of food when the silence was shattered by a new and terrible sound. The high-pitched whistle of Nebelwerfer rockets, the German screaming Mimi that struck terror into all who heard it. The barrage was directed at the American positions beyond the village, but several rockets fell short, impacting among the ruins. The survivors pressed themselves into the corners of their shelter as the ground shook and debris rained down. When the barrage lifted, they heard voices outside, German voices. The battle had shifted again, with German forces retaking parts of the village in a counterattack. Before the civilians could decide what to do, the door was thrust open and 3 German soldiers entered, their faces young but hard, their uniforms caked with dust and blood. "Rouse everyone out," ordered the corporal in broken Italian. When Maria tried to explain that they had nowhere to go, that there were children and elderly among them, he cut her off. "American artillery is coming. You stay, you die." They were herded out once again, this time in the opposite direction, up toward the higher parts of the village where German forces still held firm. The journey through the destroyed village was a descent into a hell beyond Dante's imagination. Every building was damaged or destroyed, the streets blocked by rubble and craters. The Germans hurried them along, occasionally firing back down the slope where American forces were beginning to press forward again. Twice they had to take cover as artillery shells screamed in, exploding among the ruins and sending deadly fragments spinning in all directions. By some miracle, none of the group was hit, though one of the German soldiers fell, clutching a crimson wound in his throat, his young life pouring out between his fingers as his comrades dragged the civilians onward. They were brought to what had once been the village school, its sturdy stone walls still mostly intact, despite multiple hits. Inside, they found themselves in the company of about 30 other survivors from different parts of the village. The scene was one of unrelieved misery. Wounded civilians with inadequate or non-existent medical care, children crying from hunger and fear, elderly people staring with vacant eyes at the destruction of their world. German medics moved among them, doing what little they could with severely limited supplies. A young German doctor, his face grey with exhaustion, knelt beside Sophia's injured child, examining the shrapnel wounds on the boy's legs. "I have no more morphine," he explained in halting Italian. "I can clean it, bandage it, but—" He spread his hands helplessly. The boy whimpered as the doctor worked, his small face contorted with pain that no child should have to endure. Outside, the battle was entering its final, most violent phase. The American forces had been reinforced and were pressing forward with renewed determination. Artillery pounded the German positions around the school and the ruins of the castle. The civilians could only huddle in the central hallway, the most protected part of the building, as shells impacted closer and closer. The remaining German defenders moved through the building, setting up firing positions at windows and doorways, occasionally firing bursts from their MP40s at unseen targets outside. Their faces showed that they knew what was coming. They were outnumbered, running low on ammunition and supplies, with no hope of further reinforcement. They were fighting now only to delay the inevitable, to buy time for other German units to strengthen the defensive line further north. As darkness fell on the third day, a German officer entered the shelter. His uniform was torn and dirty, his face haggard with fatigue, but he maintained a rigid military bearing. "We are withdrawing," he announced without preamble. "You will remain here. The Americans will arrive soon. Do not leave the building until daylight." With that, he and his men were gone, melting away into the darkness to make their way back to the next defensive line. The civilians were left alone, caught now in the no-man's land between the retreating Germans and the advancing Americans, with artillery from both sides still falling around them. The night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. No one slept more than fitful moments, jolted awake by every explosion, every burst of gunfire that marked the American advance and German rearguard action. By dawn, the sounds of battle had receded northward, and an uncanny silence once again fell over the ruins of San Pietro. This time it was broken by American voices, as patrols from the 36th Division cautiously entered the school building, weapons ready. The scene they encountered stopped even these battle-hardened soldiers in their tracks. 43 civilians, many wounded, all showing the effects of days without adequate food, water, or medical attention, surrounded by the ruins of their village and their lives. Captain Wasco, who had led the first Americans into the village 3 days earlier, stood in what remained of the school's entrance hall, surveying the human cost of the battle. His uniform was caked with dirt and blood, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, but he moved with purpose among the civilians, ensuring that medics attended to the wounded and that food and water were distributed. When he reached Maria, he paused, recognition flickering in his tired eyes. "You were in the cellar," he said. "I remember." He nodded, too exhausted for words. "It's over now," he told her, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. "You're safe." But as he looked around at the devastation that had once been her home, at the wounded and traumatized survivors, at the body of Sophia's husband now covered with a GI blanket, the hollowness of his words was evident to both of them. In the days that followed, the survivors of San Pietro were evacuated to refugee camps established by the Allies behind the front lines. They joined tens of thousands of other Italian civilians, displaced by the grinding campaign that would continue to move slowly up the peninsula for another 17 months. Many would never return to San Pietro. There was nothing to return to. The village had been so completely destroyed that after the war a new settlement would be built at the foot of the hill, the old site left as a ghost town, a monument to the violence that had swept over this ancient land. Maria Olivieri would live to see the new San Pietro rise from the ashes of the old, would plant new olive trees that she knew she would not live to see mature. The physical wounds of those terrible days would heal, but the memories would remain, burned into the consciousness of everyone who had lived through the battle. Decades later, old men and women would still wake in the night, hearts racing at the phantom sound of artillery, the remembered terror as fresh as it had been in those December days of 1943. The Battle of San Pietro would eventually be memorialized in an American documentary film, its strategic significance analyzed in military history books. But for Maria and the other survivors, it would always be something more immediate and personal. The 3 days when their small corner of the world became the focal point of a global conflict, when ancient stone streets ran with blood both foreign and familiar, when the accumulated history and culture of centuries was reduced to rubble in hours. It was a story repeated hundreds of times across the Italian peninsula as the war ground its way northward, a story of ordinary people caught in the merciless machinery of modern warfare, their lives and communities collateral damage in a struggle between distant powers. As we reflect on these forgotten hells that erupted across the Italian landscape during those terrible years, we must remember that behind the strategic maps and combat reports were thousands of Maria Olivieris and Antonio Russos, ordinary people whose world was torn apart by forces beyond their control or understanding. Their stories remind us that war is never merely a contest between armies. It is a catastrophe that engulfs entire societies, leaving wounds that generations may not heal. If you found this journey into the civilian experience of the Italian campaign moving, consider exploring more about these often overlooked victims of war, whose suffering and resilience deserve to be remembered alongside the military achievements and sacrifices. For in their faces, lined with grief yet somehow maintaining dignity in the midst of devastation, we see reflected the true cost of conflict and the enduring strength of the human spirit.